Dear Father in heaven, we are thankful to be here in your house on the Sabbath day. And we are thankful, Lord, for the fellowship that we can have with one another and with you. And we invite, Lord, your Holy Spirit once again into our midst. We ask that you can be our teacher, that you can be our guide, and that you can help me in presenting things clearly as from your word, and that you can help us all together to understand what it is you want us to know. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, I was asked to do this little talk here, and I do have the paper which you have, and I'm going to read from it to a large degree, just because it's easier than me thinking on my feet. But as we go through, if there's any questions that you have, I can clarify things. I may have to draw something on the board. And this is just a real basic overview. It's not a proper paper where you have all your references, all your Spirit of Prophecy quotes, all your Bible verses. So I'm just going to start reading here. In this short paper, I'm not presenting a comprehensive description of the progressive destruction of four in the reform lines, but I'm merely looking at the basic connection between them. Each period of reform is preceded by a period of darkness. The aspects of that darkness are the main theme of the reform line that follows it. The darkness itself is the result of a progressive destruction that takes place in four main steps or epochs. Each period of reform is followed again by a progressive destruction of four. One goal in this presentation is to open up a discussion in the significance of this connection. Further, I have noticed that provides an analytical tool for understanding each of these histories and the reform lines themselves. One detail that appears to be significant is that we come to understand or see a greater significance in each of the four generations that preceded the reform lines. This structure helps us place each of these epochs in history and understand why they occur. It has been noticed by me that the first step in the progressive destruction of four contains a failed reform line, where some of the previous work of reform is undone, while certain truths are maintained. In presenting this paper, I've chosen to give these ideas as they unfolded to me, which is the easiest way for me to write them. It seems that it is also the best way for others to understand my thinking and evaluate my ideas, which is what we're here for. The progressive destruction of four. The first time I encountered this idea was when Jeff presented the number 4 at Sylvan Lake. This was in 2013 in Alberta. And in fact, we both presented the fulfillment of Leviticus 26 as 4 events marked in, it should say, in the reigns of Manasseh, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah. So I'm sure we're all familiar with this idea. My presentation was on the connection between Leviticus 26 and the book of Daniel. At that time, the only period that I saw was the 70-year captivity that was a direct result of a fulfillment of Leviticus 26. My focus at the time was the events and the actions connected with their fulfillment. Manasseh's captivity fulfills the first 7 times, Daniel's captivity the second, Jehoiachin's captivity the third, and Zedekiah's captivity, really his death, where the temple is destroyed, constitutes the final of the 4 7 times. So that was kind of a revelation to me, because in understanding Leviticus 26, we all know that there's 20 years that are drawn from Leviticus 26. But the idea that it was fulfilled historically, and there's more to it that I'm not going to go into now, but at that time, just understanding that progressive destruction of 4, and that Jeff was studying the same thing, to me was impressive. It impressed my mind that there must be something important in it. Now, in seeing that one of the events that marked the commencement of a period that was fulfilled by literal Israel, that is, the 70-year Babylonian captivity, and that this period ended with a reform line, the reform line of Cyrus, I then began to see the connection between the 4 7 times and this reform line. Just as the reform line of the Millerites contains 3 angels' messages, which ends the 2300 days, The reform line of Cyrus contains 3 decrees, which commence the 2300 days and 70 weeks. I became interested not just in the events, but in the chronology of these events. I found that there were more periods than just the 70 years. There were, in fact, 4 periods of 70 years, 2 periods of 140 years, and 1 period of 220 years, that is the whole period, that were produced by an understanding of the fulfillment of Leviticus 26 in the progression of the captivity of literal Israel and its termination with the 3 decrees. So I think everybody should be able to understand my logic at this point, and I'm just going to draw this here. So we have a progressive destruction of 4, and then we have a reform line, and then later on we have this, right? So that's the basic structure that I noticed. So if anybody has any questions on that, I think it's pretty straightforward. So I probably could even draw on here. This is just the progressive right? And then this is the reform line. And this is the 3-1 combination. So obviously, as Seventh-day Adventists, especially Seventh-day Adventists in this message, we understand the 4 and the 3 making the 7 and the significance of that in, let's say, the messages to the 7 churches. So hopefully that's all understandable. Now, in fact, there are 4 decrees, right? We will see later the significance of this 4th one. We are leaving out much here, but there's enough to see that there is a solid connection between the 4 7 times and the reform line that follows it. And in the paper, I just have a drawing of a standard sort of reform line outline with the reform line of the 3 decrees.
Question.
Yes?
Should we put 4, like right here, we've got 4? On the last part?
On that one, yeah, you could. Yeah, I'm not sure which picture you're looking at, but. Oh, on the top of the second page? Okay, so that's, yeah. But on that page there, we have 3 decrees. Yeah, you could put a 4th one after that. The thing that I'm showing there is that the 2300 days, or the 2300 years, begin and end with 3 messages and 3 decrees. And there's more involved in there. Obviously, I don't have the 70 weeks, and there's a progressive destruction of 4 that precedes the Millerite time period. There's also another progressive destruction of 4, so we're going to go through that in detail. So dealing with the connections, the chronological connections here are obvious. Also, we can see, I shouldn't say they're obvious to me, but they're not always obvious to everyone. Also, we can see that the decrees directly address the period of darkness that precedes them, and I'm going to deal with this a little bit later. That is, the progressive destruction of 4, the captivity of literal Israel, is undone by the reform line that follows it. God chastises his people by breaking the pride of their power. That's the first of the progressive destructions. Scattering them among the wild beasts, that's Daniel's captivity. Bringing famine and destruction to Jerusalem, that's Jehoiachin's captivity. And causing the destruction of the temple of Solomon, that's when Zedekiah is killed. The decree of Cyrus ends the Babylonian captivity and the 70 and the first 140-year periods. Darius' decree ends the 70 years desolation of the temple, and Artaxerxes' decree ends the 140 years from the siege of Jerusalem and the whole 20-year period that begins with Manasseh's captivity in 677. So if you're looking at that diagram, I don't know if I need to draw it out. Does everybody have access to the diagram that we're speaking of at the bottom of that page? So we can see that Manasseh's captivity begins in 677, and it ends after 70 years. So sometime in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, 70 years, maybe a little bit longer, after Manasseh's captivity, Daniel is taken captive. And then from Daniel's captivity to the end of his captivity, which is under Cyrus's decree, there's another 70 years. And those two 70-year periods together make 140 years. Now, there's some disagreement, of course, regarding this chronology, which hopefully at some point we can deal with. One is there's also a 70-year period, which I don't have in here, which goes from the fall of Assyria to the fall of Babylon. So there are some differences of opinion regarding how we mark these 70 years. There's also, from Jehoiachin's captivity, 140 years that goes to the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. So the siege that happens on Jerusalem under Jehoiachin's captivity ends with the commandment to restore and build Jerusalem. And then this 70 years there from 586 to 516 is from the destruction of the temple. So the temple lay in ruins for 70 years. And what I found reading on the internet is that most people try to argue which one of these periods is the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. And what I've taken is that all these periods are mentioned in different places in the Bible as being periods of 70 years. And I could show that, but that's not really the main point of this at this time, but I did want to just briefly touch on that. So the next natural step was to look at other reform lines. So my first reform line that I studied besides the Millerite reform line was Cyrus's reform line, the reform line of the decrees. I obviously had studied the Millerite reform line to some degree at that point in 2013. But I started looking at how Cyrus's reform line matched. So the first reform line I looked at to see was the reform line of the Millerites, since Jeff had presented Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, and Thyatira as a progressive destruction of 4. I considered how these 4 generations were connected to Millerite history. And I don't think there's anything unusual in that diagram. So what we do here is we just take, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, and then this becomes the Millerite time period, right? And so we have, in that time period, we have about 1,260 years from when Thyatira begins, the 4th, to when the time of the end occurs, right? And then we have this reform line. And so this is sort of the standard, when the first angel's message comes into history, the second angel's message, the third angel's message. So we're not doing like we are presently where we're, going 9/11 and so forth. This was just our old standard reform line idea. Okay? And so I saw that it followed this pattern, that we did have this progressive destruction of 4, and we did then have a reform line. The period of darkness created by the progressive destruction is characterized by the rise of ecclesiastical authority connected to the power of the state. So when you look at each of these reform lines, it's interesting that what happens in that period, in a sense, in that falling away, that reform line responds to that darkness. And that's logical, right? There's a period of darkness. The light that's going to come is going to be answering the darkness.
Cause and effect.
Yes. Cause and effect. The end result is that the woman flees into the wilderness for 1,260 years. Protestantism rises in opposition to this persecuting power. In 1798, the papacy receives its deadly wound, and the increase of light that follows gives Protestantism an opportunity to find its own identity. The two-horned beast that rises from the earth exhibits a separation of church and state, republicanism and Protestantism. This reform line provides a test that Protestantism fails. It becomes part of Babylon, the power that once persecuted it. Further, the end of the 2300 days and the 2520 years gives rise to a new church, God's denominated people, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That church then falls into the same pattern the early church and literal Israel did. They do not follow the path that God had laid out for them. They begin their own progressive destruction of 4, typified by 4 generations, the 4 insets, etc. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that because that's sort of the main reason I'm asked to do this, has to do with our history of Adventism. So I'm going to now just go to this line upon line. So below I have laid out each of the progressive destructions of 4 with their respective reform lines that follow them. Again, this is not comprehensive. Further, there may need to be a lot of correction. So in doing this, I have spent a lot of time trying to look at each of these details, and one of the things that I find is as I lay out this pattern, I start to notice what discrepancies. That is, since we haven't done this before, we've kind of dealt with each of the reform lines, but we haven't really laid out the progressive destructions of 4, and we haven't seen that there is and we'll look at this in more detail, there is this falling away that happens in the first destruction of 4 that ties these together in a prophetic chain. So I'm going to explain this further as we go along. So the first of these is the 4 generations prophesied at the giving of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15, 13 to 16. And I'm actually studying that right now because I'm supposed to do a presentation on that, dealing with the binding off in our morning classes. So there's a whole bunch of things, and I kind of was like, there's no way I could do 15 minutes of that, but hopefully, I can at least give a sketch of what I've learned so far. And he said unto Abram, know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterward shall they come out with great substance. But in the 4th generation they shall come hither again. So here we have the first mention of the 4th generation. Correct? So in understanding, and there's a whole bunch here that we could spend a great deal of time looking at, but one of the things that we have in this 4th generation is you see, we have Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron, right? So Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. Amram, Aaron has 2 A's, right? Okay, and those are the four generations. And then we have 3 years, and then we have Moses, right? So Moses marks the time of the end. And I'm not going to deal with the other parts of these reform lines themselves, just kind of the start of them, and you'll see the pattern as we go along. Okay, does that make sense? My logic is? Right, yeah. So we have the number 3 there paralleling the 1260. Yep.
Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. Now, Kohath was the son of Levi.
Yeah, Amram's the son of Kohath.
Right, and Aaron is the son of Amram.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why they're generations. So they're literal generations in this case. Yes, Michael.
My question is, the prophecy of the Abraham covenant is given, there's 6 generations to Aaron.
Pardon, what was that?
From Levi to Aaron, there's...
Not from Levi, from Abraham. Why do we start trying to Levi?
Okay, I thought somebody might ask this question. So this is when they go down into the land of Egypt. This is when Joseph goes down, Levi comes, right? And from here to the Exodus is 215 years. There's another 215 years from the giving of the covenant. So this is Abram, right? So when this covenant's given to him, there's actually 430 years. And then there's also 400 years of affliction. So Isaac's born 25 years later, and then Isaac's weaning happens. So that's 30 years, and then there's a 400 years of affliction. So from the time that Isaac mocks Ishmael mocks Isaac, that begins the 400 years of affliction. Yes.
So then from Abraham to Levi is also 4 generations. Right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Levi.
In this period, yeah. Yes, that's true. Yeah, but the 4th generation is from when when Jacob goes down into Egypt. Right?
Yeah,
If you consider what he's saying is correct,
Mm-hmm.
you have the progressive destruction. Your premise is there's always a reform before progressive destruction. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
There's always a
Yeah, there is actually here another reform line of Joseph. And there's 4 generations. But the one that's being referred to in the 400 years and the 4th generation is from here, right?
Where
So
does that end, the 215 that was in, where's that?
that's the Exodus,
Okay.
right? Which is a reform line, right? There's a reform line of the Exodus.
And then your wife was just mentioning the darkness. Abraham comes out of Ur the Chaldees. This is the darkness of
Yeah.
the form of Abraham, right?
Yes. So part of the, see, there's a whole bunch of things. We could spend a lot of time just studying these things.
God's feelings
And-
and men are ever the same.
Right.
Don't let us get you sidetracked.
No.
We only have an hour and 8 minutes.
Yeah, and I should be able to cover that. But the thing that I find is as we start to look at this structure, we start to notice some things that actually help us in weeding out errors in our reform lines or things that we're uncertain about, and also in the progressive destruction of 4. At least that's from what I'm seeing as I look at it. It gives us an analytical tool to do that. So, okay, so also included in this list are the 4 generations of Adventism. When I first looked at these, I made the assumption that we would follow the same pattern as seen in the other lines. That is, there would be a progressive destruction of 4 followed by a reform line. In studying this on my own, I varied from from that is commonly taught. At first, I did not know I was doing this because I didn't know enough. Once I realized it, I asked Jeff what he thought, so I'd actually emailed him, and he didn't respond, which sometimes happens, I hear. But anyway, I also answered someone's question on Facebook and presented an explanation that placed the 4th generation in 1957 rather than 1989, and we're going to look at that. It can readily be seen that in each of these lines, the 4th progressive destruction of 4 precedes the reform line by some period of time, by anywhere from 3 years to 1260 years. My view is that sometime during the period of the 4th generation, darkness is complete. So we have a 4th generation come into history, and that 4th generation, the decisions that are made there, cause a complete darkness. And it's at the time of that complete darkness that the time of the end happens and God gives an increase of light. So that was my reasoning and my logic. The time of the end occurs in the 4th generation. I have not been able to see how this affects what we already understand, in that I am pretty sure that I do not know enough to see all of its ramifications. So there may be some, in doing this, I had somebody who wrote me and said that this disrupts everything, but I didn't see how it did. It's just that we were marking in Adventism. Yeah, I'll erase this lower line here. Where's the eraser? Oh, okay. So, we're going to look at this, but in Adventism, we had the 4th generation here at the time of the end, right? So to me, that didn't really make any sense. Because in all the other ones, and I've gone through all of these, it appears that there's a time period from when the 4th generation begins to the time of the end. And so we're going to look at that a bit more. I just want to deal with another aspect of this, and this is how these periods are connected together with a prophetic chain. So when I first heard the prophetic chain, that was in Oklahoma when I first heard this message. But anyway, a further discovery as I looked at these reform lines was the connection between each reform line and the progressive destruction of 4 that followed it. That is, after each of the major reform lines, there's a 4th message that contains the same pattern. I consider this to be a link in the chain that connects, it should be in my, I've got a typo, that connects the reform line to the progressive destruction that follows it. The one that is of particular interest to this study is the failed reform that follows the reform line of the Millerites. That is, in the history that immediately followed the Great Disappointment, Adventism was given an opportunity to complete the work begun by Miller and his associates. In 1851, Adventism became Laodicea, or 1850, it could have been This was a repudiation of the first angel's message. Fear God. The state of affairs led to the rejection of the first prophetic period discovered by Miller. That, in his understanding, pointed to the second coming of Christ. This is a repudiation of the second angel's message. Right? It's a prophetic foundation. Further, since you cannot have a third without the first and the second, this led to the rejection of the third angel's message in 1888. So if we're going to look at this as the Millerite reform line, what I do here is I make this 1851, 1863, 1888. Now, we of course say the three angels' message, and then the fourth angel comes, and we're in the time of the fourth angel. But God wanted that work to be completed in 1888. He actually sent the third angel's message to Seventh-day Adventists in 1888, even though they had already rejected the first and the second angel's message. So this failed reform line, and there's a lot to it. I don't have time to go into all the details, but the idea is that after a reform line, immediately something is retained and something is lost. That is, some of what this reform line accomplishes stays and comes in a new form and an understanding of a new truth. But the work is not completed that God really intended to complete.
You're talking on the human level.
On the human level, right. So obviously God, in his ultimate plan, he has an ultimate plan. His perfect will is always accomplished in the sense that he knows the end from the beginning, and he knows what we need. But he allows these things to occur because we need to learn lessons from them.
You're dealing with 3 points here, right? You're dealing with fourth generation,
Mm-hmm.
darkness, and this breakdown of the fourth.
Right. And this always happens in the first destruction of 4 for the next destruction of 4, right? And we can well, this is in, this period here is in that, because the first generation ends in 1888. So this is in the first generation.
Yeah, that's what I thought. You had that first. It's a progressive destruction, but you have only 3 days.
Right, but that's the first generation.
I understand that.
Mhm.
You're using those 3 dates to mark the first generation.
Right.
Okay.
That's all in the, so in each of the first of the 4 progressive destructions, there is a failed reform line.
Where's those 3 days?
This is the fourth angel of what should have been, and this could have completed the work. You know, we could have had the Sunday law, and we could have had Jesus come back. But in our time, the fourth angel is now in our history. So there is at the end of the progressive destruction of 4, there is then a true reform line that answers to the darkness. But the darkness has to come in somewhere, and it always comes in the first generation. And that what is laid, the foundation that is laid in that first generation, builds into the progressive destruction of 4 and the results. So, I mean, if we could spend a lot of time studying this, but we don't have time. Yeah.
One comment.
Yeah.
In 1851, she writes about the fact that they had more love for their farms and land than they did for the third angel's message.
Yeah.
This is what constitutes them becoming laity.
Mm-hmm.
In 1883, they denied the testimony of Ellen White through Uriah Smith. In 1884, they denied the testimony of the scriptures through George Butler.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't set those two events aside in that history of the first generation.
No.
1883, I'm not saying you have.
No.
But I'm just saying that we have taught in the past in the destruction, as far as how the Bible is being interpreted, has the greatest impact on the outcome of this progressive destruction.
Yeah. So they lose the fear of God here. Here in 1863, the arguments that are used, 1863,
1863 is the
The-
denial of the 7 times.
right, it's the denial of the 7 times, it's the rebuild, the image of jealousy, the rebuilding of Jericho. But it's also they're using the Protestant method of interpretation to reject the 7 times. And so that really sets the stage for what follows. Okay? And this, of course, is just a suggestion. None of this is written in stone, but this is just how I'm perceiving it. So the questions are good. Now, I do have, below that, I have a progressive destruction of the 4 chariots, and this is what happens in the time of Nehemiah, and then the Greeks, the Maccabees, and Pompey, and I'm not going to go into and explain that. But when we look at this in the Millerite or the reform lines of Cyrus, if we were to go here, this would be the building of the streets and walls, which is in troublous times. It's a reform line, and we've always taken it as a reform line. But that work is not really accomplished. They end up becoming exclusive. They do the opposite error that their fathers had done. Because they cut themselves off from the surrounding nations.
I understand.
Yeah.
I understand what you mean by Nehemiah, the Greeks, Maccabees, and Pompey, but just simply by the chronology that you laid out. And
Yeah.
those events. Why do you call them 4 chariots? I don't know.
Oh, that's from Zechariah.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so I just found that Zechariah fit in with that history, but I'm not going to go and defend that at this point. So in dealing with the rebuilding of Jericho, the 4th message addresses either the building or removal of a building, either literally or symbolic. And I should really say the 4th message where there's a failure. So that would be this history where there's a failure. That there's something to do with the building a structure, literally or symbolically. It could either be destroyed or it could be rebuilt. Obviously, when we look at the 4th often has to do with destruction. So even in the progressive destruction of 4. So I'm just going to go, obviously, we're familiar with this idea. In the case of Adventism, there was a rebuilding of Jericho in the rejection of the 7 times with the death of James and Ellen White's eldest and youngest son. And Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, "Cursed be the man before the Lord that riseth and buildeth this city Jericho. He shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and in his youngest he shall set up the gates of it." Joshua 6:26. And in the days of Hillel the Bethelite in his days did Hillel the Bethelite build Jericho. He laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. 1 Kings 16:34. In May of 1860, the Seventh-day Adventists officially adopted the name Seventh-day Adventists. 7 months later, in December of 1860, Herbert, the youngest son of the Whites, died. The youngest dies in the setting up of the gates. In May of 1863, the Seventh-day Adventist Church officially organized. 7 months later, in December of 1863, the Whites' eldest son, Henry, died of pneumonia that was exacerbated by falling asleep on the material for the printing of the 1863 chart. It was damp and cold wind. The eldest son died in the laying of the foundation. So we see a parallel. James and Ellen White are being punished for rejecting the 2520. What is happening, though, is that there is a parallel in these histories that marks what happened in 1863 as a rejection of the 7 times, just like the rebuilding of Jericho is the rejection of the 7 times. Right? So that should be well understood by Adventists. So, for insects. For Adventism, the progressive destruction of 4 deals primarily with the adoption of a false method of Bible study. The reform line that follows it restores Miller's rules and a new understanding of line upon line. In the first generation, as noted above, there is a rejection of the first and second angel's message. This period spans from 1851, when Adventism first becomes Laodicean, to 1888, when the third angel's message is rejected. The second generation, 1888 to 1919, rejects the spirit of prophecy, first in resisting the work of the third angel, and second in rejecting Sister White's counsel in almost every area. The third generation, 1919 to 1957, begins with the 1919 Bible Conference, where there they officially have rejected Ellen White's inspiration as being equal with that of the Bible writers. This period ends with the crowning act of this progressive work, the publishing of Questions on Doctrine. The fourth generation descends from this point into confusion. By 1989, Adventism is adrift, a ship without an anchor. It is at this point, the darkest in Adventism, in which the time of the end begins. The darkness is so deep that it is hardly noticed, except by a few. So this, to me, is how I look at it, and you can see in the chart below where I've marked it. And we have then 32 years between 1957 and 1989. And
38,
what's that?
38,
It's 38?
between 1919 and 1957.
Oh, yes, 38 and 32. So from 1957 to 1989, there's 32. 1919, there's 70 years from 1919 to 1989. So this places the beginning of the fourth generation in 1957 instead of 1989. As stated earlier, I do not see how this affects our message. There may be some detail we would have to change. We may decide that the third generation spans from 1919 to 1989, 70 years. If this is the only consideration, there's not a problem having the 70 years include 2 generations. So just in a brief sum up here, so things that are considered, in looking at this whole overall structure, there might be some benefit in it, even if it needs to be refined, but it does help us understand the significance of each reform line. So it gives more light on the significance, why that reform line is occurring. It gives a connection between each reform line. It shows a perfect and unbroken chain of truth. It provides a structure that aids in teaching and memorization. So from a teaching point of view, if I'm teaching music theory, it's nice to have structure. Music theory has scales of 7s with an octave, and it's kind of similar in some ways. But the more that you have structure, it's easier for people to memorize it. So whether the structure, of course, has to be correct in order to be useful in that sense. But sometimes seeing a structure in something that exists is helpful in teaching it to people. It gives us a check to see if we are interpreting each line correctly. So obviously, if we believe that God's dealings with men is ever the same, then if we look at each of these lines and we see that it can help shed light not just on the reform lines, but also in the progressive destruction of 4. And of course, we already do this. We look at the number 4 and the different progressive destructions. We look at the reform lines. But in comparing the whole structure, it gives us more things to look at. And it may unfold some further truth not yet seen. So there may be something of a benefit to this. So whatever the case, we need to prayerfully consider this. And so if there's some time for questions. Yes, Michael.
We see that Manasseh to Zedekiah is a reform line. We take that as the 700s and we parallel it
Mm-hmm.
with the end of 2520, which is reform line. So, how do you? Should I repeat the whole thing?
Yeah, repeat it.
Okay. We've seen that Manasseh to Zedekiah is a reform line. It's a parallel to 1798 to 1844. But the way that it's depicted here puts it as 4, then darkness, then the 3, which is the reform line. So is it a reform line at all in this view, or how do we marry up that concept?
I don't know. I've been thinking about that myself. So one of the things is we've used the 7 thunders with the 7 kings, right? So like you have the first 7 kings of Israel, the last 7 kings of Israel, the first 7 kings of Judah, the last 7 kings. The last 7 kings of Babylon, the last 7 kings of Persia. And we can parallel those with the 7 thunders. I still think there's an inconsistency there, and I've tried to figure it out. So I could have actually put a chart. I have all these different 7 thunders laid out in connection with these reform lines and these progressive destructions of 4. But if you think about Manasseh to Zedekiah, it has some characteristics of a reform line, but it also has more characteristics of a failed reform in that they have some character. So there's always a similarity between these 4 and these 4, right? And that's the thing that I'm trying to understand is we have this progressive and then we have this reform line, and then, like for instance, in this reform line, so this is, in this case, this will be Manasseh, right? Jehoiakim, I guess we just put K, Chin, and Zedekiah, right? So what happens in here? Is there a reform line?
Yeah,
Josiah's reform line, right? And Josiah's reform line is a failed reform line. It's a reform line. Some things are accomplished, but there's a failure there.
On both parts, the king and the people.
Yes. And so much so that just a little bit before Jerusalem's destroyed and the temple's destroyed, Ezekiel, in Ezekiel chapter 4 to chapter 6, he actually quotes extensively from Leviticus 26.
And that's interesting that the Ezekiel 4:6 is a year different.
Yes, right. Ezekiel 4 verse 6 is where you get a day for a year. And that's because Ezekiel lies for 390 years on his left side for northern Israel and 40 days on his right side for Judah. Okay, and I've actually used this as part of my chronology. I can show that from the beginning of the siege that ends in the destruction of Jerusalem, it begins in January of 587. It's an 18-month siege. If you count 40 years back, it goes to Josiah, the beginning of Josiah's reform. And if you count 390 years back, it goes to the dividing of the kingdom. And this period of the dividing of the kingdom, when Jeroboam, and then you have Josiah, there's a prophecy that tells you that Josiah by name is named by name, that he's going to burn these bones on this altar. So that means that these two dates are actually connected together, and that's 350 years from here to here. So the one prophecy points back from here, 390 years. The other one points back here, 40 years. And these two are connected by a prophecy. So there's a structure there in the chronology that I could use to check the chronology to see if it was correct. So I know I'm always interested in the chronology part of things. Well, that's from the beginning of the siege. So that's
You mean the siege of Jerusalem?
the siege of Jerusalem. It's 18 months before it's destroyed. You can't go from the destruction of Jerusalem and count 40 years back. You have to go from the siege itself. Yes?
Daniel or me?
Hmm?
Daniel had his.
Okay, Daniel.
Whenever you say a failed reform line,
Yeah.
whenever you say a failed reform line,
Mhm.
do you mean that it is a reform line that has not been completely fulfilled, or do you
Right.
mean, well, the other one I was going to say was, or do you mean that it would just the reform failed, but it was still but the prophecy was still fulfilled?
Well, certain things, it still develops, certain things develop from it that actually later relate to the period of darkness that follows in the progressive destruction of 4. But ostensibly, it's a reform that fails to meet what God wants for it. What God could have accomplished with that reform line fails.
But the
But
prophecy
in a
was
sense,
fulfilled.
all reform lines do that to some degree too. In a sense, they never completely accomplish everything God wants. But these begin at a progressive destruction of 4, and they create the seed for what's going to follow. So what Josiah, for instance, was trying to reform was they had entered into this beginning of this captivity, this 70-year period from Manasseh's captivity to Jehoiakim's captivity, and he's trying to avert the judgments that are going to come in the 4-7 times, right? Because if you repent, then there isn't going to be wild beasts robbing you of your children. But so Josiah brings about a spiritual reform, but he himself doesn't follow. He ends up dying, and then two years later, Daniel is taken captive, right? So then what follows is exactly what's going to happen in Leviticus 26. He's trying to do what Daniel did over here, right? Repenting, turning to God. but he fails. So I'm not sure if failed reform line is the best way to describe it. You know, I at first was kind of using an incomplete or aborted reform line. It was aborted.
Because it would seem like then the pattern would be broken, if you understand what I mean. If it's a failed reform line, like I was asking, you know, is it a reform line that has failed to meet complete fulfillment in the prophetic sequence of events, or is it just a reform that the people failed to reform themselves, but nevertheless, the sequence of events was still fulfilled? You see, I'm seeing it both ways. I'm trying
and I'm
to...
not really sure if I have the answer to that, because I think in some cases it's one, in some cases it's sort of the other. There's a difference. There's differences in each. See, one of the things when we look at the structure of any of these things, we can look at the similarities that exist in a structure, but we can also see the differences that exist, right? And the differences are just as important as the similarities. And in each of these reform lines, it's not just enough to say, here we have this structure, but we also need to understand what is the message that God is dealing with at that time. Why do things happen the way they do? And one thing I haven't really talked about is that these progressive destructions of 4 are connected to prophecies. So there are prophecies that God has that tell you that this is going to happen. Whether we go to the 4 generations in Moses' time, right? They're going to go into Egypt, right? And they're going to come out of Egypt, right? So there's a prophecy, a time prophecy in that case. Sometimes they're not specifically time prophecies, but the point is there is a prophecy, and the people are failing to understand what it is. They're trying to do what God wants, but they fail in some way. And so we need to understand each of the progressive destruction of the 4. We need to understand the prophecies connected with that progressive destruction, not just that it is 4. You know, so Jeff has a comment. Okay, William? Okay, give him the microphone there.
I was just going to say that the reform line that fails is the catalyst for the darkness. It's and you said it's a seed, so it's a seed.
Yeah,
you covered
seed,
it.
catalyst.
You covered it.
Yeah. So I know that this could be something that would help us in looking and studying again, going over all these progressive destructions of 4 and all these reform lines, and understand them on a deeper level, if this is true, if this is useful. Yes, Jeff?
I don't get what William said, and you agreed to, but what I think how I would express it, tell me if I'm right, is in the first generation, there's always a failed reform.
Right.
I wouldn't stick the line in there, because those of us that are used to line up on line, we're trying to portray the line in our mind. The first generation, there's always a reform, and 1888 is Josiah all over again. That's what you're saying?
Exactly.
Okay, now to a point that no one here is expecting, but I'm going to bring it up anyway because I told you I would bring it up.
Okay.
If you have listened closely to what Brother Theodore has said here in about 45 minutes, he's mentioned that there is 70 years associated with these 4, 7 times in Leviticus 26. He's marked 240-year time periods. He's dealing with the end and beginning of the 3rd and 4th generation. He's dealing with the 4th waymark in a reform movement in the failed attempt. He's now taken you into Ezekiel chapter 4 through 6 and begin to explain the 390 years and the 40 years. And my problem with Theodore's teaching technique is he throws too many provocative ideas into one bowl of soup, and it makes it difficult for at least me to take them all home with me. So
Yes.
I would suggest that you take the points that you really want to give us today and focus on it. You're getting, whether people are catching it or not, you're getting all kinds of
Oh, I know.
balls in the air right now. And
Yeah.
people aren't going to be able to remember the balls.
No, and this, of course, this here, because we dealt with the first generation that we had a failed reform line. But all of a sudden I show this whole other thing, which is like, whoa, what is that? Yes, I know.
Michael's sermon today was on revival and reformation.
Yeah.
Okay, this is similar because you're talking about reform. I would like to point out in Leviticus 26 and verse 23, it states, "And if you will not be reformed by me by these things, but will walk contrary to me, then I will walk contrary unto you and will punish you yet 7 times for your sin." The object of the 7 times is reform. That's its object. Now, for me, to see the progressive destruction of 4 is fine. That's okay. Daniel and Revelation are a complement to each other. All right? So although we've been teaching, like Michael has described, we have the 7 kings of Israel and the 7 kings of Judah in our timeline, in our reform line, right? Which marks the 7 thunders. I don't think this disturbs that teaching as long as we understand that this is just showing how the progressive destruction works. The 7 thunders can still remain intact. And so I just wanted to point this out. And even though you have a lot of balls in the air, that's typical for what goes around here. People other than you have a lot of balls in the air. And, but nevertheless, it's good to point out that I think that with further discussion and some prayer and thinking over this, Jeff said it earlier today that it doesn't necessarily be that you're all wrong, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're all right either,
Yeah, I
right?
would agree with that.
And you stated so, right? So I can see that this may help some people to understand some things about the number 4, some things about how destruction it's progressive. If this can be put in a teachable form, there must be some relation to then, if this has some truth to it, to the fall of Babylon. All right?
Yes.
Both in the literal history
Yeah.
and in the end of the world, modern Babylon.
Okay, and one of the things in dealing with this, I'm really starting with Abraham's prophecy and the Israelites coming out of Egypt as the beginning of this progressive destruction of 4 in the first reform line, right? But of course, we have other reform lines, as we saw. We saw that there's that 4 generations from Abram to Joseph, where we have a reform line as well. We also have a period of progressive destruction of 4 during the period of Judges and a reform line in the time of David. We also can go back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 1 and find the first reform line, the period of darkness with an increase of light. And, it ends with the number 7, with the rest of the Sabbath.
One second.
Okay.
Your observation about Levi, the 4 generations.
Yeah.
Now, in Aaron, his son Eleazar and Phinehas are the result. The resultant story behind that is at Baal Peor with Zimri and Cosby. And the covenant of Levi began in Numbers 25, verse 12. That's where the story lands. And Levi is the progenitor of Phinehas and Eleazar, which is the subject of Malachi 2, 1, 2, and 3, that brings you to the time when he comes suddenly to his temple. So Levi is the starting point for some of the work that goes on in setting up for the Exodus out of Egypt. He's the father of Moses, right?
Yeah.
And so all those things begin with Levi.
Yeah, and you can see as you start to look at this, obviously we need to know more. I mean, I know I need to know a lot more about all these histories. But as I've studied The beautiful thing about this message when it comes to reform lines, when it comes to studying these histories, when it comes to studying chronology, is that we see things that we never saw before, right? All of you know that. We see that this history comes alive. And if we go back and we start looking over the history and we start to take this framework and examine it, we'll see the whole idea of a fractal. Sometimes we'll see little mini reform lines in these histories. But we can usually tell what the major reform lines are because they are preceded by a prophecy that gives us some indication that there is going to be a period of time until a reform occurs. So all these other little reform lines that we can look at the story of Ruth, the story of Esther, these are stories, these are not specific prophecies with a progressive destruction of 4 and then a reform line, but they are fractals that show us details within each of these histories. And so the structural, it's the wheel within a wheel. It appears complex, but as we look at it, there's this perfect order that God has. And that's all I was trying to look at in using the ideas from the prophetic chain and seeing how these are all linked together. I believe that there is a structure that can be really useful.
Michael has something and I have one more comment.
William.
Okay, William has a comment, and then... so
All
Michael?
I was going to say is, just to recap what your main point is,
Mhm.
your main point is to defend the way that you understand the 4 generations of Adventism.
Mhm.
There's 2 dates that you see differently than what's been commonly taught recently.
Mhm.
You see 1851 and 1957, but your primary focus is on defending 1957. So in order to do that, you put in place the structure of a 4 and then darkness, and then a reform line, or a 3, so a 4-3 structure.
Right.
Am I correct? And
Yeah.
then,
Now, of course, I wasn't trying to defend
not defend, just to show
1957.
your
It's just
point.
what I saw,
Yes.
and I'm not...
Showing us how you understand
How
it.
I
So the way
understood it,
you
yeah.
understand it is you take this structure
Mhm.
and you see that the generation has to begin before the reform begins. It even has to begin before the darkness, because that last generation leads into that absolute darkness.
Yeah, that was the way I saw
That's
it.
how you're seeing it.
Yeah,
Okay.
then that's probably the main point that was asked for me to address.
So you're saying you put on the first iteration 1851?
Well, I put the start there because that's when they became Laodicean. To me, it's I'm not so concerned about the dates.
Will you draw the Millwright line and our line together?
What's that?
Will you draw the Millwright line and our line together?
Okay, so he wants me to draw our line and the Millerite line together. So here we got, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamus, Thyatira, and then we have the Millerites, so we have 1798, and then we have, the first, second, and the third angel's messages, and then again we have the 4 generations, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to have 1989, and Sunday law and the close of probation. So this is just the bigger picture, right? So this is going to be our history, right? And this is the 4 generations. So, I was marking them off as 1888, 1919, 1957, 1989. Is that kind of what you wanted? Yeah. So, but you can go all the way back to Genesis and do the same thing. They all connect all the way up to our history. And then we also have a reform line after the close of probation that isn't a failed reform line. It's when it's the end of the world. In a sense, it's failed because for Satan, he ends up getting destroyed, and there's the great white throne judgment and so forth. Okay.
Yeah, so going all the way back to Genesis, as you just mentioned, could you do the reform line for Genesis 1 and show the same pattern
Yeah,
from
I
darkness?
can, but I won't do it right now because we don't have time. But I can.
You did it for me in a minute the other night.
Yeah, but it wasn't good enough for a video. Yes, okay, so, and I guess we got Dwayne.
Dwayne and then.
Well, this makes many gears begin to turn. We have an external and an internal also observation here. Now, Ezekiel, it's either 12 or 16, verses 25 to 27, where the diadem is removed from Zedekiah. It's chapter 12, I think. Isn't it chapter 12?
Yeah,
Anyway, the reason it's removed from him and passed on to Babylon is because the reform movement failed in Judah. Okay?
yep,
And it's passed to Nebuchadnezzar because he's expected then to, the 7 times that is brought about on Nebuchadnezzar is for the same reasons externally as it was internally for Judah. The 7 times is passed upon both the Gentiles and on the children of Israel, right? So the image of Daniel 2 then is a progressive destruction of 4. You have Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome.
yes,
Is that how you,
that's true,
is that right?
yep.
Okay.
No, so there's just so many different levels, and I just don't know enough to actually understand all the implications of this, if it's useful. Okay, so we just got a couple minutes, so, Ariane?
Question. I see what you were saying. It makes sense. I cannot really see the results of if the effect of these things, but it makes sense. There's only one thing, because just what Michael mentioned, that it's about the 4 generations of Adventism, 1957. The thing is that you want to address, or it was strange for your idea at least, that the 4th generation would start in 1989, and at the same time the time of the end started. But it's the beginning of the 4th generation. That was,
Right,
but
because it
So
doesn't
I-
in the other ones.
yeah, I got the idea. But the thing is, you prove that by these lines, and I see it, but only the line, I've got only one question, the line of Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. You see 4 generations.
Because Aaron's the 4th generation, and he's 3 years before Moses. Moses' birth marks the time of the end.
Yeah, but my question is, that's a literal application, and Moses is born in this 4th generation
Yeah, and
also.
we're still in the 4th generation. So the time of the end happens in the 4th generation. The 4th generation doesn't stop at the time of the end, in my understanding. We're still in the 4th generation. Okay, so Jeff has a comment, and my time, like I can see that the clock is.
If you took the first generation up there where you have 1 on the right side,
Yeah,
would it be correct to put Ephesus underneath that, Smyrna under the second?
Yeah.
Your ES, okay.
exactly. Right.
ESPT.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the 5th church? Oh, you don't want to deal with the 5th church. You
Well,
just wanna-
no, the 5th church here is Sardis.
I know, over there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here, it's still going to be Sardis.
Okay, so
I mean,
Yeah.
it depends what
what's
level you're looking
one of the
at.
promises that I'm trying to support your position.
Yeah.
One of the promises to the 5th church, Sardis, is that he's going to give them the morning star.
Okay.
Okay, and
Which happens here.
no. The
In-
morning star, but maybe this is open for argument. I happen
Okay.
to have a belief on this. Sister White says that Wycliffe was the morning star of the Reformation.
Right.
So he's born prior. He's born in the period of Thyatira.
Okay. But it's the promise in the 5th church.
Yes, but he would be 1957.
Okay. Well,
That's the promise to Sardis. The 5th and 4th church seem to overlap.
yes. Yes. I know what you're saying, and actually that's one of the problems I've had with the messages to the seven churches, because the seventh church, Thyatira, where our time is up, is the period of the persecution. But I agree with you that the fifth church actually starts prior to the time of the end. Right? That's what you're saying. Yeah, I would agree.
Where was Louis Weir messages before we close? Was he in 1957 in our action?
No, he was before that.
Yeah, he's at that time, around that time. Okay, so,
He came out of the church in 1950, to 49.
and of course, we can talk about this for the next 2 months too. But so, I mean, we don't have to resolve everything here. But should we just close with prayer then? Daniel, would you like to offer a prayer?